R&D investments, addressing and making sure that stakeholder concerns were heard and meaningfully addressed, and finally for reducing the timeline for permitting and deployment of offshore wind. Sorry everyone, we're experiencing a few technical difficulties with the slides. They're transferring a little bit slowly, which is why you're hearing the pauses. But the next slide really outlines the structure of the Department of Energy's offshore wind strategy. And really the plan here is to promote the deployment of offshore wind, the responsible deployment of offshore wind while concurrently reducing the cost of energy. And we're doing this through 3 focus areas. And these are removing market barriers, developing innovative technologies, and demonstrating next generation technologies. And since the enactment of this strategy, the Department of Energy has invested significantly in making this strategy a reality. Most recently, we funded a series of 7 demonstration projects. And the work that you're going to hear about today is part of a portfolio of work really aimed at removing barriers to market development. And these barriers include siting and permitting and environmental concerns, really promoting the development of infrastructure necessary for industry development, and finally resource planning. The work that will be presented on today and the work that we've funded under an environmental research portfolio is really aimed at promoting the deployment of an environmentally sustainable offshore wind industry. And the slide that you see here really presents what right now is our current plan or vision for environmental research within the Wind and Water Power Program. And the work that we funded to date really embodies those first 2 numbers up there. They encompass, the work that we have funded today really encompasses baseline environmental data analysis and collection to inform the siting and permitting of offshore wind. The development of technologies and methodologies to help us monitor environmental impacts. And in the future, we plan to move towards helping fund studies that look to measure and assess specific impacts, as necessary, help in the development of creating methods to avoid those impacts or mitigate those impacts, and finally to work to develop analyses to help us evaluate the cumulative impacts of large-scale deployment. And an overarching activity that we have that through all of this work is really the effort to collect information, to synthesize that information, and disseminate that information. And before moving on, I want to note that we currently have, the Department of Energy currently has on the street, in conjunction with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a request for information on offshore wind environmental research. And this is really an effort to gather public opinion on potential environmental research that could be done in the future. And the website for that RFI is up on your screen now. We'll also post it at the end of the webinar in case you don't have time to jot it down now. And additionally, if you go onto the EERE, that's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy website, the Exchange website, you should be able to search for it there even if you don't have the link. So before moving on to today's presentations, I just wanted to talk briefly about how this work fits within the broader environmental portfolio of offshore wind research that we're currently funding. The two projects that you're going to hear about today really represent the baseline data collection efforts that we have underway. But we also have a suite of other research aimed at developing monitoring technologies and methodologies, including a project led by Oregon State University to develop an integrated sensor package for evaluating avian and bat interactions with offshore wind turbines. A project led by our Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to develop and enhance monitoring techniques for monitoring right whales during construction activities. And additionally, a project also led by our Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to improve the automated detection capabilities of infrared cameras. And then last but not least, we have a database called TESIS or TESIS, which houses environmental research on both offshore wind and in marine and hydrokinetic activities. And that database is really quite a trove of information on research that's been published and ongoing activities as well. And so I really encourage folks to check out that website. So the two talks that we'll be hearing about today are two baseline studies in the Mid-Atlantic region, New England, and in the Great Lakes. The first talk will be by Kate Williams from Biodiversity Research Institute, and her talk will focus specifically on work that BRI is doing in the Mid-Atlantic region. And this project is looking to create a better understanding of wildlife densities and movements in this region, and they're doing that through a variety of mechanisms. The second talk that we'll hear today is by Steve Pelletier from Stantec Consulting Services, and he'll be talking about work that his team is engaging in to assess bat activity off of New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Great Lakes. And before we jump into Kate's presentation, I just want to talk about some of the logistics of the webinar. You should all see to the right side of your screen a control panel. And in that control panel, there's a little dialog box for questions. And we'll be using that dialog box to ask questions at the end of the presentation. We won't be using the audio function, and we also won't be using the virtual hand chat function. So if you have a question for the presenters at the end of their talks, we really encourage you to type it into there, and then I'll pose those questions to the presenters. Each presenter will talk for about 3 minutes, and when there's about 5 minutes remaining in their talks, I'll jump on just to remind you that if you've had any questions that have sprung to mind, to begin to type those in so we can make sure that we address them. So without further ado, we're going to, one last thing that I forgot to mention. We are recording this webinar, and this webinar will be posted on our TESIS website. The page that you're seeing right now actually, it's not live yet, but it will be very soon, and we will send out an email as soon as it's available. So this website will contain a recording of this presentation and also the PDFs of the individual talks. So if you would like to reference this webinar after the fact, if you saw something you'd like to see again, or alternatively, if you have a colleague that wasn't able to participate today that you think might have interest in the webinar, we really encourage you to go to the webpage and check it out. And while you're there, I also encourage you to check out the rest of the TESIS database. Okay, now I think I can say, without further ado, we're gonna turn the microphone and the screen over to Kate Williams, who's going to be talking about the Biodiversity Research Institute's work to assess baseline conditions in the Mid-Atlantic. And just bear with us for a sec, because it may take us just a moment to change presenters.
All right. Can you guys see my screen now, Jocelyn?
We can, and we can hear you loud and clear as well.
So thank you all for calling in today. I'm Kate Williams. I'm with the Biodiversity Research Institute. We're a nonprofit based in Maine. BRI conducts collaborative environmental research on wildlife on a variety of topics, and we focus on understanding threats to wildlife and ecosystems and producing scientific data to inform decision making. As Jocelyn mentioned, BRI is the lead on the Mid-Atlantic Basline Studies project, which is funded by the Department of Energy. Our project partners include other federal agencies, nonprofits, academia, and for-profit companies. And support for certain project components is also coming from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and private foundations, among other sources. And in 2013, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources also became a key partner in expanding the original project scope during our second year of surveys that's going on now. So this is an ongoing effort aimed at reducing market barriers to offshore wind. The project's focused on gathering bird, marine mammal, and sea turtle data for areas of potential interest for offshore wind development. And we're hoping to provide regulators and developers with 2 years of high-quality baseline monitoring data for our study area on the Mid-Atlantic continental shelf. And the hope is that by utilizing this baseline information on animal movements and habitat use in this environment, we'll be able to make more informed siting decisions and use best practices to minimize the potential for wildlife conflicts with future offshore wind farms, as well as other developments on the continental shelf. Our study area goes from southern New Jersey to the Virginia-North Carolina border, and from 3 miles offshore to the 30-meter Isobath. It includes 3 federally designated wind energy areas, and those are those white areas here. And the hope is that this project will simplify environmental permitting processes for multiple development projects down the line, both by informing siting decisions and also by identifying ahead of time which species are of primary concern for particular sites. So we have 3 major field activities: boat surveys, aerial surveys, and individual tracking of birds using satellite telemetry. These field efforts are ongoing. They're expected to be completed in 2014. And among other efforts, we're also doing a comparison of survey results from aerial and boat platforms, statistical modeling and analysis of data to understand factors that influence species distributions and relative abundance, and communications and outreach efforts to disseminate project results to regulators, developers, and other stakeholders. So today I'm going to present a little bit about our methods and study design and then try to focus in on some preliminary results from the first year of study, particularly data from the aerial and boat surveys and the individual tracking studies. And I should note that all the data presented here are entirely preliminary. They're raw data still. We haven't started any modeling efforts yet. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at these maps and other data that I'm presenting. The project's boat surveys are being run by Dr. Richard Veet of the College of Staten Island. And we're collecting information on species, location, and activities of wildlife we see during surveys. The survey transects, which are these orange lines, are focused around the 3 wind energy areas in our study area. The little blue lines up off the coast of Maryland are extensions to the original transects that go into Maryland state waters, and those are being funded by the state of Maryland. We're doing 8 surveys per year, 2 per season. We started in April 2012, and we've conducted 8 surveys to date. The total transect distance is about 570 kilometers, and each survey takes about 4 to 5 days to complete, barring weather interruptions. And during surveys, teams of 2 observers rotate and use combined strip and line transect methods to observe and record animals, as well as recording environmental covariate data, such as biomass density underwater, which we're measuring using a Simrad EK60 echo sounder. We're also conducting high-definition video aerial surveys through the company High Def Aerial Surveying. We're doing 7 surveys a year for 2 years. And the study design includes intensive surveys with 1-kilometer transect spacing within the wind energy areas. So these are the green lines here. And that's 20% ground coverage within the WEAs. And then we have a lower density sawtooth pattern for broader scale contextual information, which is these lines in orange. The total combined transect length for each survey under this original study design is about 2,866 kilometers. In March of this year, we also started some high-density aerial surveys in a larger area off the coast of Maryland, which are the lines in black here, which are coordinated with the original study design. Surveys are flown using twin-engine Cessnas at 2,000 feet above sea level. Each plane has 4 belly-mounted cameras that produce non-overlapping strip transects, and each survey can be completed in 1 to 2 days, weather permitting. The original study design specified that for the sawtooth coverage, which is that orange, the cameras would be set at 3 centimeters ground spatial resolution to obtain a wide transect width and greater ground coverage. And then within the WEAs, the cameras would be set at 2 centimeters ground spatial resolution, which provides greater detail in the video footage. But we determined that the lower resolution footage from the sawtooth transects wasn't sufficiently detailed to provide the identification rates we were looking for. And so from September 2012 onwards, all transects, including the sawtooth, were conducted at the 2 centimeters ground spatial resolution. Most of the aerial survey data I'll be presenting today are from before we made that switch last year. So they're at a combination of 2 and 3 centimeters resolution. The high-definition video is analyzed by high-def employees to locate targets in the video and also to estimate flight height for flying birds using high-def parallax technology. And then once this process is complete, all the video segments are sent to BRI for analysis, and our biologists identify objects to species or species grouping. The video is auditable by multiple observers, so we have a detailed quality assurance and quality control protocol where we're independently reviewing 20% of object identifications to determine the rate of agreement among analysts. And this is an example of a still image that we extracted from some video. This is a hammerhead shark. And here's another example of a still image we extracted from the video. You can see a small pod of bottlenose dolphins here. This image is recorded at 2,000 feet above sea level. And you can see 3 adults at the surface, 2 of them with young at their sides, and then at least 5 more individuals below the surface. Boat and aerial surveys are focused on where animals are at a given point in time. But to assess risk, it's also useful to understand how animals move through the system. So in addition to surveys, we're also tracking individual movements of 4 focal bird species to help understand their migratory movements offshore, improve our understanding of migratory speed, the effects of weather patterns on movements, and seasonal use of space on the outer continental shelf. These 4 species were chosen for specific reasons, primarily because they're either known or hypothesized to be vulnerable to wind facility interactions via collision mortality or more often displacement or avoidance behaviors, or because they're closely related to species with known impacts, or their movements are relatively poorly understood. We've deployed 87 transmitters to date, with another 30 scheduled for deployment during fall migration this year. And in particular, I just would like to note that both the loons and most of the gannets were captured at sea on the wintering grounds in the study area, which is the first time that I know of that this has been done for these species. And we also successfully have been using implanted transmitters for gannets, which again, I don't think is something that's been tried before. Up to this point, satellite transmitters have been externally mounted on gannets' tails after they were captured in the breeding colonies, which works fine, but it means that the transmitters are dropped when the gannets molt their tails. So using surgically implanted transmitters is a step forward for being able to obtain year-round information on gannet movements. So we'll be combining data from boat and aerial surveys and environmental covariate data and hopefully individual tracking data into hierarchical models to try and understand what factors are influencing species distributions and relative abundance. And this modeling effort is being overseen by Beth Gardner at North Carolina State University. And this effort will include data from both the original Department of Energy funded surveys, as well as the extension surveys started this year that are being funded through the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So distributions of animals in the marine environment can be highly variable, and they're driven by environmental factors working at a variety of temporal and spatial scales. So the hope is that by combining our boat and aerial survey data with oceanographic habitat data, we can use statistical models to predict the spatial distributions of animals based on environmental conditions. The specific type of statistical models we're talking about using are particularly useful for situations where data are collected at multiple spatial scales and using different techniques, but must be integrated into a single analysis, and where there are high levels of uncertainty associated with the data because the species of interest are highly mobile and may not always be available to be seen during surveys. So this modeling effort will produce maps of predicted relative abundance by season for key species throughout the study area. And if possible, the project team will also use tracking data from this and other studies to inform models and improve our species relative abundance estimates. We're also using several methods to attempt to understand species composition, general spatial patterns, and weather-dependent and seasonal variation in offshore nocturnal bird migration through a combination of acoustic and radar data collection. Both nocturnal passive acoustic avian monitoring from the boat and the analysis of WSR-88 or NEXRAD radar data are really being approached as pilot studies here. I don't have the time to really go into much detail on these today, but let me know if you have questions or follow up with me after the webinar if you'd like to know more about these project components. So that's a general overview of our study methods. I should note that all of our survey data is going to be included in the Compendium of Avian Information, which is an existing publicly held database that's managed by the U.S. Geological Survey. And we're also planning a fairly comprehensive outreach and communications effort to get our results out to interested parties in 2014 and 2015. So on to some results to date. So far, we've completed 8 aerial and 8 boat surveys. We have individual tracking data from 87 individuals from our 4 focal bird species. And we have echo sounding data to accompany each day of boat surveys, among other data. We haven't finished the necessary QA or analysis processes to release a lot of these data yet, but I'll be sharing some preliminary results from 2012 here. And again, just keep in mind that these maps and other data should not be regarded as final. So these are preliminary data from our first 5 boat surveys. They're summarized by species group and then by the 5 months in which the surveys were conducted, and they're presented in order of abundance based on total count. So about a third of all the animals we saw during these first 5 boat surveys were gannets, mostly in November. Gulls, loons, and terns are also commonly seen during boat surveys in this period. And when you examine temporal patterns by species group, you can see that some species are in the mid-Atlantic, really only in the winter, such as gannets and loons, while others are mainly present in our study area during the summer, such as storm petrels. About 89% of all of the animals we spotted during these first 5 boat surveys were birds, and by far the highest number of individuals were seen during the November survey. So these are data from those same 5 boat surveys for non-avian animals, the remaining 11%. By far the most common species group are marine mammals, mostly dolphins. You'll note that fish are actually included here in 2 ways, either as individuals, if they're spotted individually at the water surface, or in what we call bait balls for situations where there's large numbers of relatively small fish, such as menhaden, for instance, that are swimming in really compact schools and aren't really countable as individuals. So in those cases, we note the location of the bait ball, but don't try to get counts of total numbers of fish because it's not really possible. And you'll see we actually do this same thing with fish data in our aerial surveys. Our boat survey data is being batch processed, so it's all at about the same point in the QA process, and we're not really ready to show too many maps of resulting raw data yet, but I wanted to show a few quick examples. These are from the April 2012 boat survey. And these are observations of northern gannets. They were seen in large numbers on all our boat transects, but you'll note that they tend to be clustered in the parts of the study area closer to shore, particularly in the south. These are observations of all loon species from the April 2012 boat survey. Again, they might be slightly more common closer to shore, but they're pretty well distributed along our transects. And these transects are all between about 40 and 85 kilometers long. I'll come back to some of these boat data in just a minute, but first I want to give you a quick overview of our first 3 aerial surveys to date. These are from March, May, and June of 2012, and they're summarized by location and then by taxonomic group. And our totals include birds, marine mammals, sea turtles, sharks and rays, and individually counted fish. So they exclude bait balls and other biota such as jellyfish. Large numbers of birds are observed in the sawtooth transects during the first 3 surveys. Those are those larger scale transects that go throughout the study area. And this is in part due to the length of the sawtooth, which is over 50% of our full transect length, and in part to the location of several large flocks of scoters that we saw on the sawtooth transect during the March survey, which made up the majority of the animals seen during those surveys. The Maryland WEA, which is the smallest area of the 4, had by far the fewest animal detections between March and June in these aerial surveys. So the aerial and boat surveys that I've mentioned to date were conducted over different areas and at different times, so they're not directly comparable right now. But it is noteworthy that we saw 519 sea turtles during these first 3 aerial surveys, while we saw 60 sea turtles during the first 5 boat surveys. And likewise, we saw over 5,000 sharks and rays during these first 3 aerial surveys, in contrast to 18 individuals seen on the first 5 boat surveys. These are detections of northern gannets during the March 2012 aerial survey. The map on the left with the yellow dots is displaying individual observations from the sawtooth transects, and then the maps on the right are showing summed observations from the WEA transects. In this case, observations are summed for every 500 meters of transect. So gannets seem to be fairly well distributed throughout much of the study area. And I'd like to contrast those observations from March 2012 with the boat results from April 2012 that I showed you a minute ago. Gannets are pretty easily detected. They're highly visible. So most of the differences we see between a late March aerial survey on the left and then the late April boat survey on the right are probably due to changes in animal distributions during this period rather than to differences in detectability between the 2 survey platforms. It does look like we're more likely to see gannets closer to shore in both months, but in March they're much more widely dispersed throughout the study area. In our individual tracking, we saw that the 6 gannets that we had tagged via satellite telemetry in early 2012, by about mid-April changed their earlier behavioral patterns for the winter and all started heading north towards the breeding grounds. And so by late April, when the boat survey happened, a lot of gannets had started migrating north towards their breeding colonies in Canada, we think. So we're starting to see some slightly different distribution patterns from what was going on during the winter months. This map is detections of loons from all species during the March, May, and June 2012 aerial surveys. And again, this is showing detections on the sawtooth transects on the left, and then the smaller maps on the right are showing detections on the WEA transects. And these maps were just looking at individual observations rather than summed values, and the different colors represent the 3 months of survey. So we saw a lot more loons in March, which are red, than in May, which is green, and then more in May than in June, which fits nicely with our boat survey results in that respect. The map on the right now is the loon detections from the April boat survey that I showed you a minute ago. So in both the March and May aerial surveys and the April boat survey, we're seeing loons fairly consistently throughout the study area, before they head north to breed, and basically had disappeared from the study area by the time of the June aerial survey. Next, I'm going to show you a couple of series of maps for different taxa. This is summed observations for all marine mammals from the March aerial survey. So again, the Sawtooth transects are on the left, WA transects on the right. Observations are presented in counts per square kilometer, which is a bit tricky for the bits at the end of the Sawtooth transects, which is why we have these kind of bubbles on those corners of the Sawtooth map. For these kind of data, you're really better off creating geospatial models that present you with a density surface of some kind, and that's what we're intending to do in the long run with these data, but these are sort of slightly funky interrim maps that we're using to present raw data for now. So in March, on both the Sawtooth transects and the WA transects, we're seeing some pretty good-sized aggregations of marine mammals in and near the Delaware wind energy area, probably pods of dolphins. In May, we saw more marine mammals than in March, although I should note that the scale on this map is different. So the red areas in this map have 0.3 to 1.4 marine mammals per square kilometer, as opposed to the 5 to 25 per square kilometer in the March map. But you can compare general distributional patterns between these surveys. And in general, it looks like in addition to seeing more marine mammals in May, we're seeing them closer to shore than in March as well. And in June, which we're looking at now, again, the scale is different, and I apologize for that, but we're seeing marine mammals much more broadly distributed across particularly the southern half of the study area and the Virginia WA and surrounding areas. So that's March, May, and then June. So now I'm going to go through the same progression of maps for sea turtles. These are detections of sea turtles of all species during the March aerial survey. We saw relatively few, which makes sense. It's a bit cold up there for them at this time of year. In May, we're starting to see many more sea turtles, still more commonly in the southern end of the study area. And by June, though we're actually seeing fewer turtles overall, they continue to be widely distributed in the northern part of the study area. So this map sums all our bird, marine mammal, and sea turtle observations from March. These are in observations per square kilometer, and these are just from the Sawtooth transects now. So the red area near the mouth of the Chesapeake is where we saw those thousands of scoters in the March survey. In May, we only saw about 10% as many animals as in March. And again, don't compare colors between months, just look at relative distribution patterns. But the animals that we did see were widely distributed throughout the study area. And in June, again, still fairly broadly distributed, but even fewer animals for most taxa than we were seeing in May. The thing that we actually saw by far the most of in June was cow-nose rays, which are not included in this map. We had a surprising, or at least surprising to me, number of cow-nose ray detections during the June aerial survey, particularly in the southern part of the study area. You can see the numbers that were in the Virginia wind energy area. Cow-nose rays are known to migrate into the Chesapeake in the summertime, where they're either a species of concern based on suspected population declines or a scourge on the scallop fishery in Chesapeake Bay, depending on who you talk to. But there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of information on their migration at sea. So the fact that we're seeing these big schools of migrating rays 30 and 40 miles offshore in the Virginia wind energy area is really interesting. We're also detecting them in large numbers farther offshore than you would really expect if they're all going into the Chesapeake. So we're probably detecting part of a larger migratory movement here. Another interesting thing we found during some of our recent aerial surveys is that we appear to be able to detect bats. And Steve obviously is going to talk a lot more about bats offshore in a minute. We really weren't trying to detect bats during our surveys, but we observed eastern red bats on both our September 2012 boat survey and our September aerial survey, where we saw 15 in one day. They were out there flying during the day, and the weather before these observations took place was such that it didn't seem likely that they got just blown offshore by a storm during migration. So this is still fundamentally anecdotal based on our sample size, but it's suggestive that red bats may be flying offshore during migration more than perhaps people thought they were. So it'll be interesting to see if we pick up on any additional bats during the rest of our surveys. And lastly, for aerial surveys, I just wanted to mention a couple of right whale sightings that we've had in case people are interested. We did see one from the boat during the March 2013 aerial survey, which is down here. And then we saw 3 right whales during the February aerial survey, and we're still analyzing those data. A single one up off the eastern shore, and then a mother and calf pair in the Virginia WEA. And we submitted some still images to the North Atlantic right whale catalog at the New England Aquarium for individual identifications of those. For individual tracking, so far we've deployed transmitters on 41 red-throated loons, 35 gannets, 4 surf scoters, and 7 falcons. Capture efforts were conducted in North Carolina, Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, Rhode Island, and at Cape St. Mary's Gannet Colony in Newfoundland. Project partners and collaborators for this project component include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Region 5 Migratory Bird Program, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, CDUC Joint Venture, the U.S. Geological Survey, and Memorial University of Newfoundland, among others. And these are ongoing efforts as well, but so far we're getting some interesting information from these studies about what animals are doing offshore. And the disclaimer that I'm showing now applies to the maps I'm about to show you. We haven't fully filtered these data, so again, they're still very preliminary. So the map on the left has our study area in orange, and then the satellite locations for 6 northern gannets that were tagged in the mid-Atlantic in the winter of 2012, so a little over a year ago now. And on the right, we have the larger scale movements of those same 6 gannets, where each color represents movements of an individual. So since captures in early 2012, the tagged gannets demonstrated regional scale movements along the Atlantic coast during the winter, and then about mid-April began a more consistent migration northwards towards Bonaventure Island in Quebec, where all 6 birds appeared to breed. More recently, these birds, as well as the 9 birds we tagged at the Cape St. Mary's colony last summer, have moved south to the mid-Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico for the winter. And on the left, we have satellite locations for the first 17 red-throated loons tagged in the mid-Atlantic in and around the project study area. They demonstrated smaller winter movements than gannets on average, although I would note that the 24 loons tagged during this past winter that aren't shown here moved about quite a bit more within the study area than did the 2012 birds. So I suspect if we produce a similar map that includes both years of tracking data, it might look a bit different. And then on the right, we have large-scale movements for some of the same red-throated loons. They spent the summer at widely dispersed breeding areas, including in northern Canada and Greenland. And one interesting thing is that all but one of the red-throated loons migrated up the east coast of North America in the spring, but about half of the birds returned to the mid-Atlantic in the fall via a different migration pathway in which they flew south to the Great Lakes before moving eastward to the coast. And this kind of circular migration pattern has been noted in some other seabirds as well. We have 4 surf scoter transmitters that have been deployed by BRI in the mid-Atlantic to date. I don't have a map for those 4 scoters we've tagged, but through our partnership with CDUC Joint Venture, we should be able to use a lot of their data in analyses, which is great. The map shown here is from a recent CDUC Joint Venture report and shows the locations of wintering areas for 61 surf scoters, mostly males, marked over the past 13 years. Surf scoters have proved to be pretty difficult to capture on the wintering grounds in the mid-Atlantic, specifically females. So we're going to be focusing our capture effort this fall at a migration staging area in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where a pilot study funded by CDUC Joint Venture last autumn was highly successful at capturing birds that winter in the mid-Atlantic as they make their way south.
And Kate, before you go on, I just wanted to let folks know that you've got about 5 minutes left, so if they have questions to start typing them in. We've seen some great questions so far, but if there are others on the line who have questions, please start submitting. Thanks.
And these are the tracks of 7 peregrine falcons that we captured on Block Island in the fall of 2012. The map on the left actually also includes the tracks of 2 falcons that BRI caught on Monhegan Island in Maine in 2010. And those are the yellow and pale blue lines that come down past Massachusetts. They go right through the project study area. And then once they get down to about North Carolina, both birds flew way out over the Atlantic, came back into Cuba, and then one of them continued down to Colombia. So they both followed relatively similar paths. The 7 birds that we tagged this past fall in 2012 were a little bit more variable in their path, to say the least. We have a couple of theories on what's going on with some of these birds, but at least partially some of this we think was a response to Hurricane Sandy, which was coming up this track last fall, right about the same time that these birds were migrating south. And just a quick note on the nocturnal avian passive acoustic study we're doing. We've recorded 6 nights of acoustic data so far from the survey boat while it's anchored offshore. During the September survey last fall, we detected 123 migratory flight calls in a single night. Recording conditions have generally been favorable with minimal overlap in frequencies between flight calls and wind and wave action against the boat. So we're really pleased. It seems to be working pretty well. And detections of non-migratory calls from seabirds are common, as you would expect. But we're also detecting migratory flight calls, and so far from at least 15 different species of loons, passerines, and shorebirds. So that's a quick overview of where we are so far. We'll be continuing the boat and high-definition video aerial surveys through spring of 2014. We'll be analyzing data from a recent boat and aerial comparison study this year. We'll be deploying additional satellite tags on focal bird species this autumn. We'll be continuing nocturnal migration monitoring efforts via both passive acoustics and NextRad analysis. We'll be collecting and analyzing environmental data, starting hierarchical modeling efforts this year, and we'll be continuing to disseminate results to stakeholders and regulators, which is really an ongoing effort through the conclusion of the project in 2015. Some of the main outputs from the planned modeling effort are likely to include spatial models that predict relative abundance and distribution of focal species throughout the study area by season, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And we'll also be working on several technical reports and manuscripts and outreach documents that present our results for a lay audience. And we'll be using those documents in outreach and communications efforts towards the end of the project. As I think I mentioned, we'll be submitting our data to the Compendium of Avian Information, which is housed with the U.S. Geological Survey. And the hope is that the production and dissemination of all these data will lead to more informed decision making for siting future wind developments, for permitting, and for determining priorities for pre- and post-construction monitoring. So this project is highly collaborative. Thank you very much to everyone who's involved and is supporting it. And we'd especially like to thank our funding organizations for the project, and in particular the Department of Energy. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. That was great. So we have a number of questions that are pouring in, and they're all great. And I apologize to those who have asked questions because we're not going to have time to get to every single one of your questions orally. But Kate, if you have time, while Steve is presenting, I can assign some of these questions to you to type answers to share with the audience. So what I'll try to do over the next 5 minutes is hit some of the questions that have been asked multiple times by multiple people, and then otherwise, you can look for, if you haven't had your question answered, to the extent that Kate has time, we'll try to have her type some answers to questions, additional questions. So Kate, the one question that we've seen from multiple folks is whether you're collecting altitude data for the birds, and if so, if you have any initial results on altitude that you might be able to share.
Sure. So we are collecting flight height data for flying birds from the aerial surveys, and those end up being essentially altitude bands to an extent, sort of, this bird is between 50 and 100 meters kind of thing. And we do that using parallax technology that high-def aerial surveying developed, which is the contractor we're using for the aerial surveys. And because we're using video, you actually, most animals you see in like 6 to 8 video frames. And so you can actually do the same calculation multiple times between each frame and essentially bootstrap your results to try and get an estimate, a confidence interval for your flight height estimate. So you have flight height estimates for most birds. You can't do it in all cases because of the way the process works. If the bird's flying exactly parallel to the plane, for instance, you're not going to be able to estimate flight height because in part the process is looking at differences in speeds between the plane and the bird. But we are getting flight heights for most birds that we're seeing in the aerial surveys. Unfortunately, the implant, the satellite transmitters, the implants that we're using on the sea duck and gannet and loon species, you can't get flight height on those individually tracked birds. We are getting flight height for peregrine falcons, though, because that's a different kind of transmitter that we're using for them.
Great, thanks, Kate. And one follow-up question to that, or to something that you just mentioned, was somebody was curious about how you selected the 4 species to attach tags to.
Sure. I actually had a slide that went into this in a lot more detail, and I cut it out because I was worried about not having enough time. So red-throated loons are probably the species in Europe that have been shown to have the most consistent response to offshore wind farms. In general, people see about an 80% displacement of red-throated loons from areas around wind farms when they're comparing sort of pre-construction to post-construction data. So there's a clear avoidance behavior for red-throated loons, and that is, as I said, very consistent among locations. It seems to be a long-term issue. It doesn't seem to be something where the animals eventually acclimate to the wind farms. So they're definitely a species of interest for knowing where they want to hang out in the mid-Atlantic region. Gannets, likewise, have been shown to display displacement or avoidance behaviors at least some wind farms in Europe. They also, on sort of indexes of relative vulnerability that have been developed by a couple folks in Europe, gannets tend to rank pretty high, both actually for displacement and also for collision mortality based on their life history and sort of their normal flight heights and hunting behaviors. So they're definitely another species of interest. For scoters, there are several scoter species in Europe that have shown avoidance behaviors for wind farms, either short or long term. We chose to focus on the surf scoter in particular here because we've been partnering with Sea Duck Joint Venture, who has done satellite tracking for a lot of scoter species and other sea ducks over the last 10 or 15 years. And surf scoters are one of the less understood species so far. So we're hoping to sort of gather more information on their movements. And then peregrine falcons there's no evidence that they have been affected by offshore wind power anywhere, but we know that they fly much farther offshore than most other land birds. And if you look at count data from coastal hawk watches and banding stations for raptors, in coastal areas, you tend to see a lot of accipiters and maybe like 25% falcons. But as soon as you go a little bit farther offshore, and we've seen this in our counts on Monhegan Island in Maine, which is, I think, about 11 miles off the coast, or also on Block Island in Rhode Island this past fall, you're seeing overwhelmingly falcons. So it's peregrine falcons, merlins, kestrels, make up the overwhelming majority of the raptors that you're seeing. So they just tend to be going a lot farther offshore than pretty much any other raptors. And so based on our 2010 peregrine falcon study with those couple of birds that I showed you in one of those maps, they flew right through our study area, and we wanted to know whether that was a common thing or not. And so that was why we included peregrine falcons as our fourth species. And they clearly are flying very far offshore.
Great, thanks, Kate. I think we have time for two more quick questions. One is a question about the potential for double counting of organisms. You know, if you're counting the number of animals surfacing, how do you avoid double counting or correct for potential bias?
Yeah, that's a good question. It tends to be something that you deal with during data analysis. And there's multiple approaches for different ways to deal with this. With the boat surveys, we're using vector analysis. For aerial surveys, we're not, I don't think, really getting much in the way of double counting because the plane is moving so fast. It's moving at 135 knots. And so you just sort of see animals for a split second in a couple of video frames as you're going by. But that is something that is an issue that you know, we're going to be trying to address during statistical modeling. And there's different ways to approach it. I don't know that we've fully figured out how we're going to do it yet. And Beth Gardner, who's our collaborator who's doing the modeling, would be a better person to answer this than I. But there's different methods that people have used in the past, like looking at the percentage of the time that animals spend at the surface, for instance, to try and estimate how much they're spending under the surface and aren't being detected, and your likelihood of double counting the same individuals based on your rate of speed during survey and that kind of thing.
Great, thanks. And one last question before we transfer over to Steve. Some folks are wondering if this data will be available on OBIS CMAP.
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it. The only place we've committed to putting the data is the compendium right now, but OBIS CMAP definitely has a more sort of GUI interface and is more easily accessible to people outside of federal agencies. So that definitely is something we've been talking about, and you know, if there's a lot of interest in this data set, we probably will do that. I think either way we'll do it at the end of the project and just try and get the data set out there as broadly as possible. So we'll probably end up submitting it not only to OBIS CMAP, but maybe to some of the regional ocean data portals and some of these other data sets.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. So Kate, if you would now transfer control over to Steve. Steve Pelletier is now going to present on work that his group has been doing assessing bat use in the offshore space off of the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and the Great Lakes.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen?
We can see and hear you.
Kate, that was great, and appreciate the comments about the bats as well. We're going to talk a little bit more focused on the bat work that we've been doing in the off the Atlantic and the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic coastal states and the Great Lakes. Before I jump into it, I do want to acknowledge those several of my cohorts here who do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the equipment design and testing and getting equipment on and off sites, and some of them are fairly remote and hard to get to, and the data analysis, but off we go. What I want to do is just talk about that work. These surveys have been going on in 3 primary regions, and a big part of today's talk will be you about the work that the data we collected in year one of this 3-year DOE-supported study. We'll be doing this for, again, in 2013 and 2014, with a final report due in early 2015. What preceded that was 3 years of our own work. A little bit later on, I'll get into some more species-specific information that kind of goes back and looks at some of those trends, because there's a high degree of variability in the year-to-years, and I want to kind of point out some of the findings. Not just in terms of their activity, when they're out there, are they out there, but what their species composition is as well. The study itself was initially to first test how well this equipment works. That we use in a lot of terrestrial settings, just acoustic detectors, and the types of analysis that we're doing, the methodologies of deploying and collecting this information, whether or not it's going to work in remote offshore settings that are frequently pretty wet and hard to, it's not something, type of equipment you can go back and check on and make sure it's running well. So you've got to make sure that what you're collecting out there is hopefully going to be able to maintain itself over several months. The big idea was trying to figure out whether or not are bats offshore. And if they are, when are they out there? What are they doing? Are they feeding? What about during migration? The test that we've been focusing on here now is basically from May through November, and trying to look at the different types of activity that's going on and breaking it down through the analysis of the acoustic data, what species they are, or at least what guilds, what groups, with a primary focus initially on the migratory bats, which is what the literature tells us is out there, and then looking back at each one of them too is what types of variability we're seeing in terms of their seasons or at night activities, and then when we're all done with it all, how does what we're finding compare from year to year? If you go back into terms of some of the observations, a lot of people, when we're first out here, they're kind of incredulous. That in fact we're even looking for bats offshore. What are they doing out there? But looking back through the literature, you can find a number of instances where people report large flocks of ships and large flocks of bats on ships and individuals quite a distance off, including here, a red bat taken aboard a ship 240 miles east of Cape Cod. Large numbers of bats, estimated 200, flying about the ship. These are different references that you can go back and find examples of people who are actually recording these types of observations, and sometimes, not always, including information about their actual location in terms of longitude and latitude. What I tried to do at one point was to get any of those types of data references and try to actually plot them in the Northeast. And there were pretty limited number of observations. The ones that we were finding, again, were all before 1970, with 12 ship reports. And again, you see that it says here 3 flocks of greater than 100 bats. And most of these are the migratory bats, the tree bats, the red, eastern red, the silver-haired bats in particular were the two most prominent species. The hoary bats is occasionally out there as well. We're currently also working with some of the NOAA research vessels, and interestingly enough, we're just talking to some of the crew. They're talking about being offshore, over 100 miles offshore, and having, as they talked about it, the decks littered with bats, and picking them up with buckets. There were so many. So I need to basically get back into their log data and try to get a little bit more information about that. That was just something only just within the last week and a half we were learning. Our initial studies go back to 2009, and we'd had historically done quite a bit of acoustic bat work in the Northeast on the terrestrial, on the dirt side of things, at a number of different types of site, and it was just curiosity that said, well, geez, what are we finding out on what will we put out if we put some detectors out on a couple of islands? And what turned into be a simple experiment, it actually expanded to a number of different sites. In 2009, we had 12 sites, including sites out here like Mount Desert Rock, which is over 26 miles from shore, depending on how you measure it. And we had two shoreline sites, Schoodic and Owl's Head, but the rest were all islands and rock ledges. Again, from Halfway Rock out through off the coast of Portland, all up to Petite Manan. In 2010 and 2011, we went back out because every site we went out in 2009, we were finding bats. So we were a little curious about let's see with that anomaly, what more can we learn? We decreased the number of sites we went to, but we did increase up to Ken Island, which is almost here up in Canada. It actually is in Canada. And Appledore is off New Hampshire, and then we included a Narracous buoy off the coast of Massachusetts, about 6 miles offshore. With now support from the Department of Energy, in 2012 we've expanded that, so we're into an area where we're back here in the back to many of the sites we went to off the Gulf of Maine, including a number now in the Gulf, in the Great Lakes, and a number of them down in the Mid-Atlantic coastal region. Essentially, we've got 3 different areas, and what we're trying to do is, individually look at each one of these to see how movement occurs within them, but to also step back as we collect data and to compare the 3. This is actually becoming even a little bit more important here, and with the influence of white nose syndrome, which originated here in New York and has since spread throughout much of the eastern U.S. and into Canada. And as probably most of you are aware, are responsible for up to 7 million bats that being killed by this to date. We're seeing that kind of information is starting to. We're seeing these types of trends in certain areas, so it'll be more important as we go along here. But we've got a number of different sites that are on the edges of island locations, include a few coastal locations, a number of different island sites. You'll also see on here, this is a track in last fall we went out on, again, the NOAA research vessel Pisces, and collected data offshore there as well. The workhorse of this is the acoustic detectors. Most of them are banana bat. We do use several different types, but this has been by far the one that we've relied on the most. The big deal in doing these things is not just putting something out there and seeing if you're going to be getting bats, but some of these sites are you can compare easily against each other, but some are real contrasts where you've got sites that have no vegetation, just rock. They're good distance out. Some will be only these buoys that are, again, just isolated structures. There may where there may be an opportunity here where you've got historic observations and where you've got maybe trends where there may be some sort of learned bat activity because it's a site that stays there. Will we still be seeing that same type of activity, where you've got temporarily put buoys or even moving ships? So a good variety of different sites and site types that we need to look at. And in the Gulf of Maine, a number of them involved different lighthouses, because these were remote areas where you wanted to get something up off the ground, and sometimes, again, some of these islands were fairly large. Some of them were forested, a lot of different types of habitat opportunities for residents to occur. Others were again just rocks, maybe a shrub or two here, and the physical structure itself as some sort of habitat. a good mix. We were concerned about things such as the influence of a light on attracting insects and or bats, and so we put several on islands in broad areas, some detectors on small towers, and collected information out there just to compare against that. And frankly, we did find one site, Seguin, we can talk about a little later, that has a light that stays on constantly and had a marked effect on the drawing insects and bats as well. Overall, though, we did not see that type of influence on our data. The Atlantic coast, we've got 3 sites that are fairly offshore, including one in Albemarle Sound here. It's in the middle of the Sound. We've got the Chesapeake Bay Light Tower, which was recently acquired by the Department of Energy. It's an excellent opportunity. It's about 15 miles offshore and completely isolated by itself. It's a perfect platform. The Department of Energy is currently renovating that, and we hope to be able to continue collecting data out there. Also in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, about 7 miles offshore, one of the little platforms out here, we had another opportunity to put some detectors, as well as another site here along the coast up in Cape Hamilton Park. So as another coastal point of reference. In the Great Lakes, up in Lake Superior, a couple of remote islands on the outside edges, again at lighthouses, a buoy marker out in Lake Erie, on the western part of Lake Erie, and again several other towers, all in different along the coastal locations. Just a brief review of the types of the level of effort that was put out in each one of the years. You can see in 2009 we were out at 12 sites. We decreased that to 9 in 2010, and they further decreased it to 6 in 2011. But we actually, last year, again with DOE support, we're out to 25 sites. What I'm reporting on here is the data that we've collected from 15 of those sites. And so it was a huge expansion and good opportunity to start collecting regional data. The survey periods were important from late July through the end of October. For most of these, in a couple of sites in 2011, we actually had equipment that was left overwintered out on some of these islands, so we were actually collecting spring data. And our intent now is, from now, the remaining next few years, is to be deployed through May through November for the next 2 more years after 2012. Number of survey nights, again, increased substantially with 2012, up to 2,600 nights, so we've actually collecting data out of sites, and these are ones where we actually have collected data. The number of nights represented over the course of years of calendar nights. But again, and if you look back at the level of effort, again, 26,000, 27,000, 21,000, and now we're 6-7 times more of that, 150,000 call sequences that were recorded in 2012. The calls are, the acoustic equipment is a great tool, and provided you use it right. What we want to make sure is that we're inferring the right kind of information from this thing, and just getting activity level is a point of reference. It's great, but you don't know if it's a single bat because it's not identifying individuals. It's identifying different calls, but you don't know if the same bat doing it over and over again. So activity levels, the number of call sequences we get for each night was one parameter. But another way of looking back at it, and probably a more realistic way to analyze some of these data, is how frequently are we seeing, for the percent of nights that we've got detectors out there that are operating, and we know they're operating, how many of those are we recording activity? And that timing of activity is at what time of night, and how many hours, how long is it? And with these activity also what is our composition of species, and for the most part we can detect most of the species that we expect to see here. There's certain species that the myotis, which is several different species, the small-footed, the northern long-eared, and the common little bats are all myotis species, and because their calls are so similar with the type of detector we're using here, for the most part, we've grouped those into myotis. We are doing some inferences where we are breaking those out, but the large body of this work is going to be grouping the myotis into one group, one guild. So again, all of this information is great in terms of general bat activity, but we can break it down by species, by guild. And why I put this confounding factors down on the back again is just to remind ourselves about the limitations of these detectors. And the fact is there's such a variety of different locations and different island types and island sizes and distance from shore and the types of structures that are on these things that there's a lot in the analysis that needs to be taken account of. Quickly, to looking at some of the results, we found the equipment works really well. We had an extremely high level of success, and we've only had a couple of sites over the years where we were unable to collect data reliably for long periods of time. Part of our efforts involve doubling up the detectors, so we've got two side-by-side that we're collecting at the same XYZ coordinates, and we'll sometimes have a problem with one detector, but we've got a backup a lot of times. We've also are pairing different types of detectors in some places just to test their efficiency. We can stop right here to basically, one of the biggest things we found was everywhere we've looked so far at every site we've detected bats, and it's not just been a single species, but sometimes several species of bats. With resident migratory bats, activity noticed at most sites. The resident term is a little bit subjective here. They're not simply, we find some instances where we can find bats that actually will stay for very short periods of time, and because of the fact that there were no bats present on or before then, that's a clear indication of bats moving through on migration. And but we've got some bats who will actually stay and forage for longer periods of time. Most of our activity is highest in late September, late August, middle of September. And again, for a big picture result here is that bats were generally present during 20% of the surveyed nights, which is a significant number. If I break these down into the different types of sites that we've got out there, the average number of hours per night with activity. Not surprisingly, you see that the coastal areas, which is on the terrestrial side of things, with a lot more structure, a lot more habitat opportunities out there, you're going to have a higher number. But frankly, as you work through this, even our structures, and our structures here are the buoys that are only 2 to 3 meters. The detectors are 2 or 3 meters off the surface of the water. The things by themselves are maybe 4 or 5 meters high and miles offshore. And yet we're still seeing activity on these at these sites as well. If you look at the number of call sequences per detector night, again, these are numbers of calls that we're getting. That's this line here in red. No surprises, we're seeing a lot of on the coastal side of things, medium islands were a little bit more. I'd be careful about reading more of this. I'd like to see 2 or 3 years more of data on this thing to look at these numbers a little bit better. But we're seeing surprisingly, not surprisingly, the coastal, a lot of calls on the coast. Some of these medium islands, and again, it depends on where they are, but still calls all the way down through. The percent of nights, though, that we're actually seeing ranges from over 80, was about 88% all the way down to 40. So despite the fact that there's maybe low activity, there were still a number of nights that there was some activity by bats out there. And then this is, again, just 2012 data that we're looking at. If we look at over the course of the numbers of weeks here, in this week 35 is mid to late August period right here, we're seeing that the activity level, the number in terms of the numbers of calls, is peaking in these 2 points, which line up pretty well with what we understand and see on the terrestrial side of things in terms of migration. In terms of the percentage of nights, though, however, where we're picking up acoustic data, it's still a fairly broad number of nights. This is another way of looking at the data, and again, this is just 2012, where the sites that we've actually picked up data, we've plotted over the course of numbers of weeks, and the blue period is showing this is the survey period that we're actually out, and the green is 75% of the acoustic activity that we picked up during that time. So that's where it is, and then you see that 1 week of peak activity. And it would be real nice if we saw a nice vertical line of all these things lining up, but obviously that's not happening. We hope to see that tighten up a little bit more as we go we go along. But again, when you start pulling out some of the different site factors that you've got here, there's a lot to be taken into consideration. Early on, we talked about some of the historic information that's provided. It talks about the eastern red bat and the silver-haired in particular, and the horays. These are considered our tree bats. They're more long-distance migrants. They're the ones that go longer distance. And if, again, looking at the literature, they're talking mostly about these species. So that was early on. That was our focus. But if we look back at the different now I'm looking back at our data that we've collected since 2009, and we go to all these different structures. And again, these were the ones remote. That idea that you see mostly migratory species farther offshore on little things holds true with 95% of our calls that we've collected during those times as being the eastern red bats. You can see, 5%, the horays are small, no myotis, and silver-haired, which we somewhat expect. But so the theory that these migratory species are seen farther offshore appears to hold true. The rock islands, which again, some of them are, in excess of 20 miles offshore, though we still pick up a fairly large number of myotis in these things. So they're not non-existent out here. That breakout is a little bit more, again, with the 3 different migratory species. But this was a surprise to us. There's a lot of noise in this data, again, because you need to individually look at this, at the different sites and the characteristics. But with all of the sites compared together over the 4-year period, that was the breakdown. Our medium island sites, again, even a higher concentration of myotis. What we did is, I was telling you about Suburban Island. Again, that was the light with that stays on constantly. We pulled that one out of that because that had a huge influence on the number of calls. So we're not counting that in the analysis here. But again, a good number of eastern reds, the migratories, but over half of them being myotis. The larger islands, again, same thing. We've got a good percentage of a good, almost even split between the eastern reds and the myotis.
Steve, apologies. Oh, sorry, Steve. Apologies to interrupt, but I just wanted to let the audience know that you've got a few minutes left of your talk, so please start submitting. We've got a number of questions so far, but please think about submitting questions now if you have any.
Thank you. Coastal sites, again, no surprises here. So we see these pulses in activity in terms of migration. We got lots of times where there's no activity or very low activity, and then we get these big pulses that come that are very telling, and I think are actually some of the more important things we're learning from this. Mount Desert Rock provided a good example. Here's a site that went through a couple of big hurricanes, or two back-to-back in 2009. Our equipment continued to run. What we see as an example of these pulses here, we don't have any data collected between June 10th and end of July, but then we get 62% of our activity within a 2-day period, with most of these calls being myotis. Again, 26 miles offshore within the first 3 hours, and then nothing afterwards. So what that's telling us is then that you know, these bats are stopping by and continuing to move on, so it's a clear sign of migration. Again, silverhairs were also another pulse. And you can see, you compare 2009 to 2010, these types of activities with 3 different species. There's peaks here, those peaks are occurring again. So it's, again, no real nice lineup. There's obvious weather influences here, but there are peaks that we're seeing. The synchronized presence, what we're talking about is the 3 different species here of the surveyed nights with activity. And with the eastern red dominating, again, most of the number of calls, and these are the Leno, it's a silverhair. They are more of a concentrated peak. That's, again, what we're seeing over the course of the 3 years. Peaks in activity, again, to go back to that point about the silverhairs, more concentrated. Eastern reds are occurring over a longer period of time, and it's these types of trends where, you know, you're hoping to see obvious points of time that we're going to have higher activity levels, and frankly, we're going to be seeing as much as we do on the terrestrial side of things in that mid-August through late September period. Some other concentrations, 56% of the silverhairs in 2002 were one night in 2012 on Matinicus Rock. Matinicus Rock is about 14 miles offshore, if I recall. 4 nights, again, early September for total bat activity. Halfway Rock, that was a 2009 site only, but we had 75% of our silverhair activity on one night. Petite Manana Island, 93% of the myotis documented on one night. That was the same night as 66% of the total bat activity. Our Chesapeake Light Tower, I showed you the pictures of that. An interesting site. We need to go back and get more data here. 87% of the bat activity occurred on one night. But look how early that it is back in May, so which is another anomaly. Some of our conclusions, the consistency of the bat activity patterns decreases with island size and increased distance from shore. That consistency begins to fall apart. What we did find, again, is bats were present at all of our sites during an unexpectedly high percentage of our surveyed nights. Certain species, the eastern red bat, were more likely to be documented offshore than others. For instance, the big brown of tricolored bats. We frankly didn't see any tricolored bats that we could positively affirm out there. We are wondering quite a bit about the influence of white nose syndrome here, and particularly in terms of myotis abundance, as we're seeing a little bit of a decrease regionally. Other conclusions, offshore bat activity is not limited to just the migratory tree species, the eastern red and the silver-haired or the horace. They appear to use stopover offshore islands and other structures as stopover habitat, and that this migratory activity appears concentrated in early September through the mid-August through these events, which the same type of trends that we see on the terrestrial side of things. Where we want to go with this is we're going to continue the same surveys that we were doing in 2012 through the next 2 years. We want to try to fill in a couple of gaps and a couple of more sites as we get that opportunity. In particular, though, we've been able to get out on 4 new buoys and possibly several more. But in 2013, we're about to be putting out on 4 new buoys off the Gulf of Maine, but also using the NOAA research vessels, the Pisces, the Henry Bigelow, and the Gordon Gunter, and putting detectors out on those. And some of these are going several hundred miles offshore. And again, all of the data that we're looking at in terms of the total bat activity, the bat activity by species, by guild, by location from shore and proximity to islands, to other shorelines and island sizes themselves, and see how those all play against each other. And also how all of this is influenced by weather. I'm assuming that it's going to be much like we see a lot of our avian species that are moving during migration. There's certain nights when you know that there's going to be good migration, and we're hoping to see that same types of trends here. We also want to provide, I believe this data is going to be important in terms of better understanding the influence of white nose syndrome. And at the end of the day, particularly the seasonality of this, time of season, time of night, on how that type of information we can strategically use it in terms of avoiding and minimizing any potential impacts that may arise because of offshore wind development. With that, there's a whole host of folks who've been very important to work with, supporting not only allowing us to put our equipment out on their site, but in many cases actually offering us boats and access to these things, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without them, in particular the Department of Energy with this support. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks so much, Steve. That was wonderful. I know that we're a little over time, and I apologize for that, but I would like to take a few minutes to allow Steve with the opportunity to answer some of the questions that have come in for him. Steve, there are a couple questions that have come in that are related to questions about distance from shore. And the first is kind of a general knowledge question. It's the question about what our current understanding is about how far bats can travel offshore.
In general, again, we're several hundred miles offshore bats have been recorded. Every place we've gone, and including the ships, we're finding bats, and so it's largely unknown. I think the farther distance from shore, we're more likely to be finding those true migratory species, the tree bats. I've talked about the eastern reds and the hories in particular.
Great,
silverhairs.
Thanks. And then the second question around distance is a question about what the greatest distance from the shore you have. What's the greatest distance that you have study sites from shore, and if you could talk for a little bit about why you decided to kind of those distances and not potentially further out.
It's a great question, and the holy grail is to have that perfect platform that allows you to get out there and deploy something that's not going to get ripped apart by the wind and the waves. Frankly, we were very opportunistic in our early years, and we got out as far as we could. And again, 26 miles offshore. At that time, no one was suspecting of finding any bats out there. There was some concern, though. If you look at a place like the Gulf of Maine, and where you've got a number of islands, and our islands being treated as different stepping stones by different species that may be moving between islands, or are they truly going way offshore? We have, frankly, not having a platform until now with the NOAA research vessels. By going out, will we be able to test that a little bit more directly. How we've been analyzing the data is a percentage of water that's around our individual detectors. That was one way of determining how remote they truly are to try to get rid of that stepping stone effect, as well as the total distance from shore. And so there's a number of ways that we're actually evaluating that. And then on top of that, we're actually looking at the structure itself. Is it something like a small buoy that, or is it an island, a relatively large island that's got you know, trees and other types of structure there that allow both feeding and stopover habitat. So a number of ways we're taking a look at it. In this next coming year, we've expanded. We've got 4 buoys out, and again, these 3 ships. It's going to learn a lot more about how far they can. But if I go back to the literature, we're talking bats as far as 240 miles offshore that have been observed, and large flocks of bats as well. So.
Great, thanks. And I think that we've got time for one last question, and I apologize to those who have submitted questions that we don't have time to answer. But Steve, the last question for you is there any possibility of adding radar to get flight characteristics of bats around the antibat detectors? For example, might you be able to get flight elevation data or some supporting information about abundance?
It's a great question. We've worked with radar regularly. Working with radar offshore is problematic just because the radar itself, if you're not careful in how you operate it, you're going to have a lot of background clutter because of the way the radar is being bouncing off the water surface. So you're very careful. We're actually working on that now and trying to figure out and working on better ways of collecting that type of data. What's particularly frustrating with the bats is that what we know about bats for the most part offshore is they appear to fly lower, and they're just relatively over the water, over large bodies of open water, usually within 10 meters of the surface, relatively low. So that makes it's certainly not your sweet spot if you're doing radar surveys. So it's a problem there. It's frankly something that we're continuing to work with.
Great, thanks, Steve. And thanks both to Steve and to Kate for taking the time to present today. We really appreciate it. And Steve, if you would be willing to just pass screen control back over to us, that would be wonderful.
And how can I do that? Let's see.
You go up to the top. You should be able to change the presenter back to us. Go to the GoToWebinar.
Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I also want to thank everyone who's on the line for attending today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and we welcome any feedback that you have after this webinar or any additional comments or questions. And I also just wanted to post the web address for the request for information one more time in case folks didn't have an opportunity to jot it down before and wanted to. And we really would welcome and encourage any feedback that you have on this RFI. And then additionally, I wanted to post to the TEFIS website one more time. We will be posting this webinar there, both the recording and the PDF of the presentations, and we'll send out an email to this group to let you know when that material is live. And additionally, as I mentioned before, there's lots of other good information on TEFIS, so I recommend checking it out. So with that, thank you all, and I hope you have good remainders of your days.